My name is Nathan Hatfield, and today I'm standing in the bottle garden here at Oakland Plantation. Today Oakland is part of Caden River Creole National Historical Park, and we are located in Natchitoches Parish, Louisiana, right in the central part of the state. So the garden that I'm standing in is directly in front of the main house here at Oakland Plantation. And the plantation was established in the 1780s. The house was built in the 1820s, and some of these bottles are nearly 200 years old. Now, as time went by, the family that lived here, they kept adding to the bottle garden, and they replaced bottles that had been broken. And so today, along with those old French wine bottles, we've got 1970s Budweiser bottles. And the bottles, like the buildings and the landscape, they represent a 200-year story. As you walk around the property here at Oakland Plantation, you see buildings from the 1820s, and then you see modifications that represent the 20th century. And so here at Oakland, we're not frozen in time. You see the evolution of a plantation over the course of the last 200 years. Right now I'm standing in the parlor here at Oakland Plantation, and this home was constructed in the 1820s. And the Pruden family, they lived here for the next 2 centuries. So we have a combination of furnishings representing all the different generations. And pretty much everything in the house belonged to the Pruden family. So we're very fortunate to have so many of their original things. All around me in here, there's paintings and photographs of the Pruden family. And they were here from the Spanish colonial period up until the early 1980s. And there's very few plantations that have stayed in one family for that long. And so this family had to endure the Civil War, boll weevil outbreaks, the Great Depression, other economic ups and downs. And it wasn't just the family, but it was all the other folks who lived and worked out here. Of course, in the early days it was enslaved labor, and then they had tenant farmers and sharecroppers, but there were also skilled workers, carpenters and blacksmiths. They had a crew of people who worked in the house and cooked and cleaned and did laundry. So it was because of the hard work of generations of people. That's why Oakland is what it is today. And it wasn't always happy times out here. There was conflict. Some people left and never returned. But enough people stayed to keep this place going. And it's because of all those people. That's why we have what we have today. Right now we're standing in the dining room at Oakland Plantation. And above the dining room table is this. This is a manually operated ceiling fan. When they were using it, they release it from that piece that's holding it up. So it hung down. And there's some kind of rope tied through that ring. And a slave, a kid, maybe 10, 11 years old, would have stood somewhere in this vicinity, pulled on the rope, and that would have swung back and forth for the duration of the time the family was eating their meals. And that kept the air flowing, and it also helped keep flies off their food. So the nickname for this is the shoe fly fan, but the proper name, the formal name, is the punka, and that term came from India. And right now I'm standing in the 1950s era kitchen here in Oakland, and this part of the house is very nostalgic for our visitors. Just about everybody who comes in here recognizes this table from either their childhood or for grandma's kitchen. And when people see this, it's not what you think of when you think of a plantation. I know for a lot of Americans, when they think of plantations, they think of 1800s, Scarlett O'Hara, Gone with the Wind. And when you see this place, Oakland, it makes you think differently, because this place was in operation for 200 years. This doorway leads to the ground floor level of the Oakland Plantation house. So right now we're in a small room underneath the main house, and they had a full-time slave, a nanny, who lived down here. So if she was down here and she needed to access the children's bedroom, she could climb these steps, and there's a trap door that allowed her to access that area. And we know that women lived down here as late as the 1930s. Right now I'm standing in front of one of Oakland's remaining slave tenant cabins. And after the Civil War, many of the slaves left, but some of them remained, and they continued to live here and work here as tenant farmers or sharecroppers. And they still had tenant farmers living in this building well into the 20th century. In fact, even as late as the 1950s and 60s, there were still people living in this home. Today the cabin is furnished to look like it did in the 1950s. So we're talking almost 100 years after slavery. When slaves lived here, the furniture was very crude. Your bed may have been just a mattress stuffed with cotton that sat on the floor. You might have had a few dishes, a table, maybe a chair or two, but very, very simple. As time went by, the tenant farmers could acquire more furnishings. Right next to me is this chifforobe or bureau, so you could keep your clothes in there. This bed, iron frame bed with a homemade quilt on it. So by the 1950s and 60s, the tenant farmers had a lot more possessions than their ancestral slaves did, but it was still a very simple lifestyle. They may have had as many as 7 or 8 people living in this building, so it was pretty cramped. During the summer months, the building was designed to promote cross ventilation, so it could stay relatively cool in here, but on a hot August Louisiana day, you're going to be hot no matter what. In the wintertime, they relied on their wood-burning fireplaces, and they would help insulate the building by putting layers of paper on the wall. And it could be paper like what you see here with the floral patterns. On different sections of this building, there's also some newspaper. And when the Park Service started preserving this building, they left the paper intact as much as possible. So we have this mesh covering to protect it, but visitors can still come in here and see the layers of paper that were put here over the years by the tenant farmers who used to call this building home. Right now we're standing in the overseer's house here at Oakland Plantation. And this building was constructed 1860s, early 1860s. And he basically ran the day-to-day operation of the farming aspect of Oakland. The restoration of these buildings is an ongoing process. And this building is unique, and you can see behind me the wall is a material called buissage. It's quite common here along Cane River, and it's a mud mixture. Mud mixed with maybe some straw or some moss, and while it's still moist, they pack it into the wall in between diagonal and vertical cypress beams to kind of hold it in place. And this material, it does need to be tended to and preserved. It's an ongoing process. And the American tax dollar helps to make that possible. And every American pays taxes. And so a little bit of that money comes back to our national parks. So technically, any American taxpayer, this is your park. You're helping to preserve America's history. So right now I'm standing in the store here at Oakland Plantation, and this store was built a few years after the Civil War. And the purpose was to serve the free tenant farming community here on the plantation. And the tenant farmers who shopped here, quite often they didn't have money until the cotton was picked in the fall. So much of their expenses or much of their purchases here were done through credit. And then once the cotton came in, they had to settle their debt at the store. And if it was a real good year, everybody made a little bit of money. But if it was a bad year, maybe the boll weevil came, then you had nothing to show for it, but you still had debt. And that debt could carry over from year to year. And it was a cycle of debt for a lot of these tenant farmers. And they had a little bit of everything in here. It was a general store. It was also a post office. And for a while it was even a gas station. And so after the work day, these tenant farmers might come and get their mail, buy a few things, and maybe just hang out on the porch and gossip and play music or play dice. It was sort of like the community center here on the plantation. Right behind me here is the overseer's house at Magnolia Plantation. They had various overseers who lived here throughout the years. But from the end of the Civil War until the 1890s, the Herzog family lived here. The Herzogs was the family that owned the plantation. They lived in the overseer's house because their home had been burned down during the Civil War. The 1890s home is still owned by the Herzog family. It sits on private property, and currently it's not open to the public. But all the other buildings at Magnolia, they're part of Cane River Creole National Historical Park today. Well, right now I'm standing in front of the gin barn here at Magnolia Plantation. So once the cotton was picked, it would be brought over to the gin barn, and all the seeds would be removed, and the cotton would be pressed into compact bales. And from here, the bales could be sent either downriver to New Orleans or maybe on a railroad to other places where that cotton would then be shipped all over the world. And so this is where the raw cotton was processed and turned into a bale, and we're going to go inside right now and look at the equipment that helped make that happen. And right behind me is a mule-powered cotton press. So after the cotton is picked and after it's ginned and the seeds have been removed, they need to press it into a bale. And this is the device that allows that to happen. And so they would load the cotton up through the upper portion, and they would have mules walking around in 360 degrees. And as they walk, this is going to turn around a giant screw that is almost 2 stories high. And as this turns, this box is going to come down with enough pressure to compact that cotton into a tight bale. And after the bale is complete, they roll it out, wrap it in burlap, and from there is ready to ship wherever it needed to go. Now, as steam power came along, these types of cotton presses became obsolete, and today there's very few left. And we think that what we have here at Magnolia is the only mule-powered cotton press that's still in its original location. So this is a very rare thing, and Magnolia Plantation is one of the only places in the country where you can see this. Well, right now we're standing next to steam power equipment that came a little bit later on. And when the cotton was picked in the fields, it was dumped into large wagons, and those wagons would be brought up here to the gin barn, and they had vacuum hoses that could bring the cotton up here to the second floor, and then the ginning process begins. And this is the cotton gin. It's more or less the same gin that Eli Whitney invented back in the 1790s. The principle's the same, but it's steam powered and it's a lot bigger. And they had 2 gins side by side. So the cotton is going to go through these prongs and saw blades, and after it gets through here, all the seeds have been removed. And then it's time to move over to the double box steam powered press. So after the cotton is ginned, it goes through these series of tubes and condensers before it finally reaches the double box steam powered press, which is right here to my left. Right now I'm standing inside one of the slave tenant cabins here at Magnolia Plantation, and this building is made of bricks, and there's very few slave cabins in the United States that are brick. And they had several hundred slaves here before the Civil War. And after the war ended, a lot of those slaves became free, and many of them moved on, but a lot of them remained here as tenant farmers. And we know that in a few of the cabins here at Magnolia, people were still here up until the 1970s. A lot of visitors to Oakland and Magnolia, they ask us, how were the slaves treated? And we don't really know. The slaves were most likely illiterate, and we don't have any of their stories. The families that lived here, the white slave-owning families, they left us with diaries and letters. Very rarely do they mention a slave or what their relationship was like with those slaves. So we can only speculate. We know that there were very cruel slave owners, and we know that there were very kind slave owners. Most slave owners were somewhere in the middle. Now, we know on any plantation, there had to be some threat of physical violence. That was a fact of life. And whether or not they resulted to that very often, we don't know, but it's pretty certain that that threat of violence was here at Magnolia and also at Oakland.
Hi, Hi, Dale Nielsen at 3J's Four-Way Grocery in Cypress, Louisiana. Which is about 10 miles south of Natchez City and 3.5 miles away from Oakland Plantation, the national park. Oakland Plantation is just such a great thing to have 3 miles down the road from us. They're part of the Cane River Creole Heritage Area, which encompasses about 30 miles. So for us, as visitors come in, we're right off the interstate. A lot of them, just like these travel writers, would not be here if it weren't for Oakland Plantation. So it certainly draws people into the area. And it's a joint effort with us as we have people come in and to view plantations, whether it's Melrose or maybe St. Augustine Church. They ask questions of how to get started, where do we find it, and I always direct them to the national park because of the knowledge of the area and the history of the area. They're just so professional with the guests that are coming in, and they're able to direct them very easily and very cordially to their final destination. A lot of times people end up coming down, looking at one, realizing that there's more than just that one property out there, and they end up spending 2 to 3 days spending money in dining areas or stores downtown and that type thing. So can't say enough about the partnership that independent business and the municipalities have with the National Park Service. They just do a tremendous job.